Here. Great, cool. So today we're continuing our food farming and justice mini-series. Like I said, last time that we met, I want to do a review of the previous lesson before we get into the lesson of this week. So last week we defined some important terms and their significance, and we emphasized the importance of how our government defines them and what that means for our food systems players, like including ourselves. And then lastly, we got into how we can influence these systems through food justice, as we distinguish several concepts within food justice, like food sovereignty, and learned about the organizations engaged in this important work. And of course, we use our fictional Dreamberry Farms owner and principal operator, Farmer May, and our examples to explain these concepts. So looking forward, if we want to think about our mini series of food farming and justice as an ongoing story about food systems, today we're going to zoom into this graphic that I showed you last week. And specifically, we're going to focus on the farming part with giving consideration to the biological systems. However, we're going to focus on your plants in particular. I know there's a cow there because y'all are focused on cultivating plants for your garden designs. Cool. So, any questions about that? Review sounds good. All right. So today is all about plants and their ecosystems. When I say ecosystems, what comes to mind? We're going to do a poll everywhere question, and I will drop the link in the chat. But there's also a QR code now since they update it. And tell me if you see this pop up on your screen too. What comes to mind when you hear ecosystem? Okay, so I'm seeing answers come in. Did a word cloud, I figured that'd be fun to look at. Oh, elements, balance. What else? Biotic. Ooh, curious to see what people are saying about that. Coexistence. Equilibrium, community, organisms. Cool, it sounds like you guys have a pretty good understanding of ecosystems, self-sustaining, interconnected. Cool. So today we're going to see how well our understandings of ecosystems align with one another's. And more specifically, we're going to define and explore ecosystems and ecology, and then take a closer look at how the basic plant structure impacts how plants interact with other beings and ecosystems in order for us to start to understand what I'm calling the ecology of agroecosystems, which I'll define and get into. But as you will see with our Farmer May example that I'm going to bring up a lot during this presentation, understanding these concepts is very important for you to make better decisions about your future gardens or the work that you even do now in whatever gardens or farms that you might be engaged in. Does that sound good to everyone? Any questions? Alrighty then, let's get into it. So what is ecology? Well, I define it as the scientific study of the interactions between organisms, their abiotic environment, so meaning non-living environment, and each other. There is a researcher and former employee of the USDA's Forest Service, Herbert Schroeder, who further elaborated on this definition in the 1996 paper, stating that ecology as a natural science, quote, focuses on understanding the physical, chemical, and biological interactions that take place between organisms and their environment. So it's not just how they're interacting on one level, it's several different levels, those three larger categories. Make sense? Cool, I see nods. So in the previous slide, I said that today is about the ecology of agroecosystems. So first I wanna make sure that we're all on the same page by defining an ecosystem. I really like this one by the US Environmental Protection Agency. They say that An ecological system or ecosystem is a biological community consisting of all the living organisms in a particular area, which is you're including humans in these living organisms, and the non-living components such as air, water, and mineral soil with which the organisms interact. So if you're wondering what a biological community is, as I know we've talked about really looking to make sure we understand terms, Britannica is defining it as an interacting group of various species in a common location. So that's what they mean by a biological community. And the EPA's definition, as much as I like it, has a lot of words. So I just bolded the ones that I think simplify this definition even further. So an ecosystem is a biological community of living organisms and non-living beings with which they interact in a given area. Living, non-living, given area, biological community. Cool. So when we're looking at this image, I say that we are looking at an ecosystem because it's a biological community, which we had defined before, of living organisms. So we have Farmer May there, we got our plants that interact with the non-living components. So we have the sun, the clouds, the air, minerals, etc. in a given area, our area being Juneberry Farms, and we're looking at plot 1, let's say. Make sense? Cool, or nods. So when we're talking about the ecology of this ecosystem, or more specifically, our agroecosystem, I'm talking about how these living organisms, specifically these plants, cultivated by Farmer May, interact with other living and non-living beings. And this can include areas beyond this plot and even, beyond the farm itself. But for our lessons, we're just going to focus in on interactions happening on Juneberry Farm and in the real life gardens and green spaces that you're visiting. So specifically, we're going to look at how the plants, you and Farmer May, can repel or fall victim to disease-carrying insects and predaceous herbivores like the caterpillar that I have circled here, or the rabbit in this image. And how these same plants can protect against stresses like intense sun and precipitation, attract pollinators like butterflies and bees, fight predators like nematodes that are in the root zone, and compete with other plants like this one here. So, and of course, in something as heavily cultivated and manufactured as an agroecosystem, there are humans interacting with our plants too, and represented by this little stick figure. But if we're ignoring those non-living beings that I brought up, that rain, that sun, and think a little bit less about the humans, just for simplicity, we can categorize the interactions that I've named between the plants and other living organisms as forms of symbiosis. I'm sure that term has come up before for you. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, has an ocean exploration program, and they define symbiosis as the interaction between two dissimilar organisms living in close physical association. So these broad general categories or types of symbiosis are mutualism, or when both organisms benefit, like when our bee up there gets nectar from a flower, gets dusted by pollen, and then pollinates the next compatible flower that the bee is visiting. Commensalism, which is when one organism benefits and the other organism is not harmed or helped. It's pretty neutral. If one of our animals here, for example, were to pick up a prickly seed-containing fruits, I don't know if you've ever seen like those fruits that are on the ground that stick to your clothes. Sometimes it's very often that those will stick to fur coats of, like, let's say a rabbit. And then we'll take that, traveling to find more food or wherever it's going, and that seed might fall into the soil and germinate and grow. The bunny didn't get anything out of that interaction, but the plant benefited because now it has another area where it might survive better, or maybe the same amount, but it has more opportunities to reproduce in different areas. So that's a positive and a neutral commensalism. There's parasitism, which is when one organism is benefiting at the expense of another. So this is like when I pointed to those nematodes that are attacking the roots of a plant just to make sure that they can get their own nutrients, which is important for them. And competition. So to some extent, throughout the process of trying to get resources, the two things that are competing will hinder each other from getting those resources. So they're both losing out in some way, shape, or form. Like these two plants here, when I talked about competition earlier. But these are just like 4 big basic categories, and I'm not going super in depth into anything because I'm trying to get this bigger picture so that you get these broader concepts, like I was saying, that will help you in the work that you do. Symbiosis also includes like other types like mensalism and subtypes like obligate mutualism, which you don't need to know any of that for our intents and purposes. And in your gardens and on Dreamberry farms, you would most likely see all of these types of and forms of symbiosis. So then there are non-living factors like water and air or wind, light, temperature, and depending on your growing medium, soil. And growing medium, I just mean where your plant's roots, essentially. You don't have to do it in soil. I know there's like hydroponics where it's just water, as an example. And they too, these non-living things, will interact with plants in a variety of complex and very interesting ways. And as a grower or a cultivator, however you want to identify yourself in this work, you're influencing and impacting all of these relationships. And it can be very difficult to do this positively over the long term if you don't understand how the plants respond in these interactions and why they're responding in those ways. So to help you develop that understanding, we're going to take a deeper look at one of Farmer May's plants by identifying its basic plant parts, naming their critical functions, and to a lesser degree, explaining how they fulfill these functions. And we're going to use a lot of Farmer May in that as well. Okay. So here's our zoomed in view of our flower. So we just took one of these and isolated it. And also you can see now, since it's a closer up view, there are roots. So what is a basic plant part that you see here? Instead of pull everywhere, you can either just get off, mute, put it in chat, say all the parts that you see, and I'll pick one.
The stem.
Stem, that's a good one. Come on, basic plant parts.
There are roots.
Roots, a great one. What else do you see here?
You see the flower?
Yes, the flower. That's the one I was looking for. Perfect, because it's the very first plant that we're going to talk about. So what does a flower do? What is its purpose? Like, why do we have flowers? What are they doing for plants? Whoops, kind of showed you already, but you can name out other things if you think there are more, or if you didn't see it, you can guess.
They release pollen.
Ooh, they're releasing pollen. Cool. Anything else? No. Okay, that's fine. So their main purpose is to attract pollinators. That's why we have flowers. That's what they're there for. That's why plants will grow them. So we have a purpose, but why are they attracting pollinators at all? Well, I have this video that I wanted to share part of. Do you see it on your screen? Okay. Oh, I think I have to probably reshare to make sure I can share my sound. So let me do that first. Oops. Just want to make sure you'll be able to hear this. Share sound. Okay. Can you hear that?
Flowers take enormous energy for a plant to produce. They may be beautiful, but that beauty is, in one sense, a burden. So why have flowers at all?
Flowers are managing the reproductive biology for the plant.
To illustrate the basic sex life of a flower, we can use a lily. There are, of course, the recognizable petals, but at its center are the real stars. The stamens are the male parts that produce pollen. The pistil is the female part that contains the ovaries. Plants have elaborate strategies to avoid self-pollination, like the female part ripening at a different time than the male pollen. When the pollen from another flower lands on the pistil, usually deposited by a passing insect, a pollen tube grows down, carrying the sperm to the egg, and reproduction takes place. producing seeds inside of a fruit. The pretty flower, therefore, with those recognizable petals and scent, is really just good packaging.
Flowering plants were the first advertisers in the world. They put out beautiful petals, colorful patterns. They put out fragrances. And they gave a reward, such as nectar or pollen, for any insect that would come and visit them. And what were they advertising? They were advertising the female parts and the male parts that were hidden within the center of this flower. So if they could attract these mobile pollinators to come and feed in this flower and then fly to another flower some distance away and repeat this process, they could effectively carry their male genetic material in the pollen grain to another flower.
It is believed that there are as many as 400,000 different species of flowering plants, including things as different as roses, wheat, and even apple trees.
Oh my God.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you a nice overview. I feel like visuals are really great for understanding that process. Are there any questions about what we saw on the screen? Nope. Okay, cool. I'm seeing people nodding. Okay, so let's put this flower that we have back into the context of Juneberry Farms. Oh, I don't know why it's trying to play it. Okay, here we are. We're back at Juneberry Farms. Farmer May grows her tulips in one plot in the spring, which we saw before with all the yellow and reds. And then she grows other flowers like cone flowers in another plot for the summer or early fall, because she knows that they will attract all kinds of pollinators, like talked about in that video. And those will visit her food plants too. So you see that bee that's traveling off to a pumpkin patch, because that's a flower that actually needs to be pollinated by some outside force. Something that the video didn't say that I do want to bring up is that there are a lot of flowers, a lot of plants that will actually pollinate themselves. So if you think about a lot of bean plants and tomatoes, like they're not actually looking to have other organisms come in and pollinate them. They do that process on their own. But at the top of the video, the narrator says that plants expend a great deal of energy creating these flowers, but they don't produce energy. So what part of the plant does produce energy? So we're back on Poll Everywhere. We have this graphic here, and you're just going to click the part of the plant where you feel like, yes, this is the part that's producing energy. Gotta say, the sky does not produce energy.
I didn't
Or
even
plants, at least. Yeah, I get it. I've done that before too. All right, so I'm seeing most people click leaves. There are some people in the roots. There's a person in the flowers. Flowers do not produce the energy. Okay, so if you click the leaf, you are correct. If you didn't click the leaf, there was a possibility that you could have been correct, because you can also produce energy in other places that share a similar characteristic to leaves, which we'll get into. But we're just going to focus on these leaves first. So when we're looking at leaf functions, we know that they're producing some kind of energy-rich substance for many plant processes. But what else do leaves do? Any guesses aloud or in the chat? The longer you wait, the longer we all wait.
They absorb the sunlight.
Yes, they're creating energy that way. Okay, I'm guessing people maybe don't have guesses. Oh, wait, was someone about to say something?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say they photosynthesize.
Yes, they do photosynthesize. Great. All right. So the thing I was looking for was actually cooling. So they're releasing heat energy. And you're probably wondering, if you've never heard that before, what do you mean leaves are cooling what? Oh, someone put something really interesting in the chat. And what the next thing we're going to look at is like, how is it doing this cooling thing that I mentioned? And also, how is it producing food? It seems like you guys are aware of the latter, at least. Well, if we look at a leaf and we zoom in on a cross section, we see different types of cells there. The cooling happens because of the small oval solid green cells that are on that outer part that have like red arrows pointing to them. Those are called guard cells. Let's get a close-up of those cells. So when it's a very hot day, the plant will open up these cells. So they actually will flood water into it, and it makes its shape open up so that there's actually like a hole now in the leaf. And when that plant opens up, it's releasing water that's going to absorb a bunch of extra heat. So instead of that heat going into the cell and stressing it out and causing all different types of damage and meltdowns, that energy goes into the water, and now the leaf is cooler and it doesn't have to stress out about things being terrible. So without this process, which we're calling evapotranspiration, there are other things attached to this, but we're just focused on this opening of the stomata first, of these guard cells, which the stomata just being the opening. You don't really need to know that. If without this process of evapotranspiration, that heat energy, like I said, is just going to damage that plant, because where else is it supposed to go? There's enough energy to fulfill the processes, but now there's extra energy. Okay, so that's that part. Then you have some things called mesophyll cells. Again, you don't have to be really obsessed with that concept, but within that, those cells that are represented by these yellow ovals with green specks, there are different things that we can call the machinery that's capturing light into molecules that are then converted again into more stable molecules that the plant can then break down to release energy for whatever it needs, like growing those flowers that we mentioned. And this process of creating energy via light is called photosynthesis, which people have brought up. And it can be represented by this equation here. So you have carbon dioxide, that's a gas that also comes in when you open those stomata. Water, then you have that light energy. Things happen in photosynthesis. Eventually you get glucose, oxygen, some water too, but they don't have it here. Cool. So that's very interesting. It's fine and dandy, but again, like, why do we care about this in the context of our farming? So we're going to look at Juneberry farms again. But does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, just want to make sure I check the chat. Cool. So let's talk about these processes of cooling and photosynthesis in the context of this farm, right? So let's say it is a very sunny, unusually hot, late spring, early summer day. There are no clouds, and Farmer May is now wearing something light to just keep from getting too warm. What do you think is going to happen to her plants? So the choices here, they'll eventually wilt and die. Maybe they're growing faster, slower, they're losing water, they're gaining water, or you're like, I don't know. Not into trick questions, so there actually is more than one answer here. Someone's saying they're growing slower. On a hot day. They eventually wilt and die. That's a good one as well. Okay, so we gave our guesses of what might happen. So I'm going to tell you what might happen. So with this increased sunlight, you're going to have more photosynthesis, and we're also going to have a greater air temperature. This means assuming that there are enough molecules of carbon dioxide and water, because that's also important for photosynthesis, the plant can produce more food. So when there's more sun, there's like more of these rays for it to capture, you know, assuming it also has the machinery to do it, because it might not have enough sites where photosynthesis can happen. So it can have more food for this plant. But what about the increase in air temperature? You know, what is that doing? Is that as positive as, you know, getting more food for your plant? While the increased temperature generally increases respiration and evapotranspiration, so that you remember the guard cells open, water's leaving. At face value, that sounds pretty good, and it absolutely can be. Increased respiration means that the plant is breaking down sugars more rapidly to carry out various processes, including those that lead to greater plant growth. So here is just showing some like common agricultural crops that will see an increase in growth with an increase in temperature. There's like a peak, and then after a certain point, you see it start to go down, right? So meanwhile, that increase of evapotranspiration means that the plant can cool down and not overheat. But like anything else, if there's too much of respiration, too much evaporation, evapotranspiration, it's not good for the plant. So too much evapotranspiration, which again is that, you know, there's a loss of water happening, means that the plant can dehydrate. So people who are looking that the plant will wilt and die, that's a possibility because of this. So a farmer may, if she can't keep watering her plants enough to keep up with this loss of water, she can lose many of them. And of course, that would make Farmer May very sad and probably very worried. But thankfully, this has not happened to Farmer May because she knows a lot about gardening and farming. She has an extensive irrigation system in addition to her watering cans. And this, with this water, her plants will be okay. But how is this plant getting water? What plant part helps that? I'm just seeing things in the chat. I'm seeing roots. Yes, these are great answers. Okay, that's more of the, I guess, indirect, the most, the true source of this water, absolutely. But I'm thinking about the stems because the leaves are most directly attached to those stems. And they're transporting much needed water via xylem to the leaves. But what else do stems do? I know, more participation. Again, you can put that in the chat or say it aloud. Ooh, transport nutrients, I see. You're holding up the plant, you're supporting the flower. These are really great answers, taking in nutrients from the soil. All good answers. Okay, so these things are true. They're also transporting nutrients, they're providing structural support, meaning that they're holding up these flowers and their leaves, they're bending toward the light as they need. And the green stems can even photosynthesize, but they're not providing nearly as much energy as our leaves do. So another question, but I'm going to answer this. It's rhetorical this time. How are they doing all of these things? And since we already talked about photosynthesis and we know that the leaves and flowers are attached to stems, I'm only going to talk a little bit about their transportation system. So the stems are containing these like hollow vessels inside of them that can transport water, hormones, food, or those raw materials for the plant food, which are people are naming as nutrients or minerals. The vessels transporting food are called phloem, while the ones transporting water and minerals are called xylem. So again, we're going to look at this at stems and their function in the context of Juneberry farms, so that we're making this connection constantly between why on earth we're learning all this stuff and how it applies in real life. So it is another sunny day. The plants are well watered, and Farmer May is wearing her light colored clothes again. Thinking about stems, what happens to the plants on a sunny day? More guessing. Best way to learn is to try. It's a really simple answer. Stems get thinner. Oh, that's an interesting one. They flop over, okay. That's a good one. Assuming they get really hot, right? They dry out. Okay. So this one's a little less morbid this time. I don't know if you noticed this before, but all of the plants, for the most part, as it gets closer to the sun source, it'll straighten out some. A lot of them are bending. And I just circled this area over here so you can really see them bend the most over there because they're farthest away in this, fictional context, right? So the flowers, like I said, on the right are representing that the best. So the cells actually on the opposite side of the sun or the other intense light source, so maybe you're indoors and there's a really intense light like off to the side of you. And so these cells will actually elongate, which will push the stem and whatever's attached to it, so those flowers, those leaves, towards the sun. And this process is called phototropism. There are lots of types of phototropism, but we're just talking generally about how these plants are bending. And if you're indoors, you might see your plants grow really tall and spindly sometimes when the light source is very far away. And this can produce plants that can't withstand wind and other environmental factors very well. So a thing I really wanted to say here is always choose a location with adequate lighting for your plants. You don't want to stress them out, growing really tall and not being able to support themselves and flopping over like people had mentioned in the chat. And I'm going to reiterate this a lot because I see it way too often where people will be like, my plants don't look great, what's happening? I'm like, well, the light is far away. You got to bring it closer. But we're going to keep pushing forward to our last plant part that people kept bringing up, which I love, our roots. Okay, now what do roots do? Same thing. Share your guesses aloud or in the chat. I feel like some of you really hate this. Okay. Get water from the ground, collect nutrients from the soil, absorb nutrients and water. Perfect. This is perfect answers. Okay, so the roots, no surprise, are how these stems are getting the minerals or those raw materials for plant food and the bulk of their water. So, you can open up the stomata and water can come in, but you're not getting a lot of water from that. But they also provide some anchorage and they're storing reserves for the plant. And if you're like store energy, what do you mean by that? And just think about like root vegetables like potatoes, and like potatoes, for example, are really full of starches and that the plant transport it from the leaves that it made via the phloem to those roots to store away for it. And talking about phloem, if we're looking at this diagram, which looks complicated, has a bunch of terms you don't need to know, you can see that the phloem and xylem are represented by these like pink and greenish colors in the center, and they're surrounded by a bunch of other cells that help the plant take up those materials that they need as they need them. So, and collectively, these cells will take advantage of a lot of natural forces and other organisms to get what they need to fulfill these functions that we're listing. Put this list on the right-hand side of the slide, lists some of those ways that the plant cells can do this. But like before, we're going to go through each of these briefly. I'm going to ask you less questions, don't worry. Except this time, I'm not going to include any visuals of Farmer May as examples because these concepts are a little too complicated to exemplify it in a way that makes sense and that you can most likely follow. So let's get into these, how roots function, right? So looking at this cross section of our root, starting inside, like I said before, there's this xylem. So if we're looking right here at this green highway of sorts, that's our xylem. Phloem is in there too, which is not in this image. Then there are these other 4 layers that I wouldn't worry about knowing the names of. It's really not that important. And on the outermost layer, there's this little appendage that comes out that has like black arrows in it. You see that at the edge on the right side. This is the root hair. Now, this is a term I just want you to know because I've seen a lot of people confuse root hairs for molds. I mean, if you look at this and you don't know what root hairs are, you'd probably think, oh my gosh, something is trying to eat my plant's roots. My plant's going to die. It's just root hairs. They're just allowing them to have more surface area to do the things that they do. Cool. So now that we've seen our roots and our root hairs, let's look at the first bullet on this list of ways that plants carry out their functions, those electrostatic forces. So this basically means that there is a force across a very specific distance that makes the opposite charges attract each other and the like charges repel each other. So that idea of these 2 positives not wanting to be near each other, positive and negative, being attracted to each other. So a positively charged ion like potassium, which is one of those nutrients that plants need, it is attracted to this like negative part of a soil particle. And you're like, what does that mean? We'll get into that for sure, but not today. So you have this potassium, that's a K, on this, they say clay mineral, it's just a type of soil particle. And it'll swap places with a positively charged ion on the root hair, which is like, there's this cell wall. So this purple bit is a part of the actual root itself, like a hydrogen, on a negatively charged portion of this root hair. And so that means that now the hydrogen's on this little clay particle and the potassium is now on this plant, which the plant will take in and use it for whatever it needs to use it for. I would talk about why the ions swap in the first place, like if they're the same charge, why are they swapping? But that requires me to talk about something called ion affinities, which is just, it's a really intense concept to think about at this early stage of your education. But do you have any other questions about this, about how a plant is using positive and negative forces to get what it needs? Is that clear enough to you? Seeing more nods. Thank you, my nodders. Okay, so let's get into the next thing on this list, which is this natural flow of water. As you probably learned in your science class by now, substances will naturally flow from areas of high concentration of itself to areas of low concentrations of itself. So in this diagram, you have a lot of these little red dots or solutes and water moving away from each other to areas of the beaker that have no red dots, which is why it now looks like this evenly dispersed image on the right. But because the plant is taking in a lot of nutrients, there are times when the concentration of a nutrient is very low near the root. So you have these roots that are here, like in the left, this image that you saw before. And there's lots of, I guess, empty space if we're thinking about how there are less nutrients near the root, because the root has taken all those inside of the plant. So now there's a gradient there. So nutrients in higher concentrations farther away from the root in water will move towards the root zone. So this mass flow is what it's called, of dissolved nutrients move into the plant as the plant is absorbing that water for that transpiration process that we talked about. So in order to release water, you have to get water. So the roots are taking in that water. It's creating this difference, this lower concentration. A bunch of water comes over there along with a bunch of nutrients, and then the plant's able to take in those nutrients. Does that make sense? You follow that? Seeing more nods. Cool. All right, so let's look at these last three listed ways that plants are performing these basic functions with a focus on water absorption and nutrient uptake. So the plant getting water, the plant taking up nutrients. So there's also changes in pressure, biological regulation, and that concept of symbiosis. So the first one is taking advantage of pressure gradients inside of the plant. So like nutrients moving from high to low concentrations, the water, of course, can also move from high pressures to, or more negative, to lower pressure within the system, or more positive, we're thinking about the water potential. So with biological regulation, that's when the plant is sending, different plant parts will be sending signals to each other. So, the leaves might be like, we need more water, please bring in more water. And then the roots are like, okay, we're gonna bring in more water. So then it uses energy to do that if it can't take advantage of the natural forces that are already there that it can take advantage of, like lower concentrations and things wanting to move into that. Okay. Then there is this symbiosis one. When we went through what that is, we defined it, so we don't have to do that again. But what I do want to say is that plants can form a more mutualistic relationship with fungi that will actually embed itself into the root cells. So if you're seeing here, there are actually this red portion is actually a fungus that's getting into the root cells, and then they're able to exchange different things with each other, nutrients primarily, but also protection to some extent. So there's that real life concept of a mutual relationship that's really beneficial to your plants. So if your plants can have these relationships and have this thing that looks like an infection inside of its roots, then it's good. So that's just for you to know that sometimes you'll see things that are not a part of the plant. It will be some type of other organism, but it's not necessarily hurting your plants. Sometimes these relationships are really beneficial, that they just look like they're harmful. Do you follow all those concepts? They make sense to you? Any questions? Now, sometimes it takes a minute for things to settle in. Okay. All right, so we end it with roots because roots, as you've seen in my diagrams, are often living inside of a very versatile and interesting medium, our soil. So I see that we have 7 minutes left. So I am going to do one more slide to talk about soil a little bit, and then we'll finish up soil for the rest in the rest of the lessons that we do. We're also going to get into more like hands-on, tangible things that you can do. Okay, so soil. It's not essential to plant growth, although people a lot of times say that it is. But it is often the medium that people do use when they grow plants, especially if you're growing outside, you have soil, you have in the ground, so why not use it, right? And as such, it is very important to understand soil, including its functions and how it forms, its composition, all those little pieces, so that you understand, you know, why putting some plants in sand don't work as well as putting some plants in clay, right? How would you know that? Why would you know that without understanding soil a little bit? And when you're aware of, you know, why the soil does what it does and how it's interacting with plants, you know, if something's not working out, you could probably be like, you know what, let me go check the soil because maybe that's the thing that's not right because this doesn't look right. Okay. So what are all of these functions of soil? Well, for one, it is a medium for plant growth. It holds water, contains nutrients, supports that plant anchorage, you know, having the plant have something to grab onto, its roots. It regulates temperature. It's providing some protection from harm. If it has good structure, it's also providing adequate ventilation, just meaning that the plants are able to access the different gases that they need, like oxygen, because they need that for their respiration. So that's one function. Soil is also a habitat for many organisms, such as worms and insects. So soil is also the home of microbiomes for mycorrhizae, which is that fungus that I talked about, I think 2 slides ago, rhizobia, and other microorganisms that can and often do interact with your plants. So there's a whole living community in there beyond the plant matter that's there. Soil can also be an engineering medium. So it provides a very strong basis upon which people can build structures like a greenhouse, let's say, of Juneberry Farms. If you have solid soil that's not going to shift around a bunch, that's a perfect place to put your greenhouse, assuming it also has a bunch of sun coming in as well, right? Soil can also act as a system for water supply and purification. So if anyone has a septic tank at home, or there's things called septic drain fields, and lots of really cool filtering systems where if you put different soil particles of different sizes and put water in it, it'll take a long time, but you can get clearer water at the end. And additionally, soil is a recycling system for nutrients and organic waste, like the products of decaying organisms. So you might have a plant or a weed even, let's say, that you pulled out and you left it there. So it decayed because it didn't get water because its roots were out, you know, wasn't able to access what it needed. And then it starts to break down, and then it's breaking down into something, right? It's breaking down into nutrients a lot of times. And those nutrients can be used for the next plant, or maybe not a plant, but an animal of some kind. And so that's that recycling process. And lastly, very importantly, soil is a modifier of the atmosphere. It's like, wait, this thing on the ground is impacting what's far up above. Why? Like, what is that? It's also radiating heat energy that's absorbed by the sun. It's exchanging gases like oxygen and nitrous oxide. And most relevantly, when we're suffering from extreme climate events because of elevated CO2 levels, soil is actually storing, or another term you might hear is sequester, carbon. So this concept of a bunch of carbon that would otherwise heat up the atmosphere further is actually being contained in soil. So if you manage your soil really well, you can help support climate change mitigation, or that concept of slowing this down a bit, this process that's hurting us in a lot of ways. So I don't have time to go further than that today, but how many of you knew about these different functions of soil? Did you know all these things already? Just curious. Kathy shrugs. Cool. All right. Are there any general, I'm seeing things in the, that was my next thing, is if anyone has questions. And someone asked Perry, what causes soil to exchange gases with the atmosphere? Interesting. Okay. So I can't go super deep into it, but I will very generally say, So we're thinking about these processes. Plants are doing a lot of things. So let's say that the roots are respiring, right? Meaning that we respire as well. We're breathing in that oxygen. We're letting out carbon dioxide so that we have energy to move, for me to talk right now, for example, let's say. So when the roots are releasing that carbon dioxide that it doesn't necessarily want to keep in all the time, that carbon dioxide is now in the soil right there. And then you might have some other type of organism in the soil that then takes that carbon and is like, hey, I want that carbon. And it will incorporate it into, you know, its own structures. It'll fix it into something totally different. And then here it is taking carbon dioxide that would have otherwise been in the air and is now somewhere in the soil. And this will happen with other different types of gases. So gases are being released not necessarily all the time by the soil itself, but the things living in the soil. And it goes back and forth taking things from the air because there are things in the soil like that oxygen that I talked about. So the roots are taking in oxygen that's inside the soil. And so now there's less oxygen there, and maybe more oxygen goes into the soil. So that's what it's doing when it's exchanging gases. Did that make sense? All right, Perry said thank you, so I'm guessing yes. Any other questions about any of the things we talked about? Yeah, so after Betty talks about garden design and shares all this really awesome information with you, I'm going to talk to you about site assessment. So thinking about like the really, I guess like plant science-centered things that you should do for your design so that you can make them pretty and functional. And the soils, we'll talk more about their formation, those characteristics, so that you, again, understand why some plants, like I said earlier, can be in sand and not in clay and vice versa, and all the other in-betweens. So with the site assessment as well, we're going to talk about what you need to consider, different types of tests and surveys that you can do, and all these other really cool tools that you can employ to make sure that you have a good site for whatever it is you're trying to do. So with that, I'm going to drop the quiz into the chat, and that would be the end.